Hey everyone, welcome to a spotlight episode of Comics Rot Your Brain, the podcast where professional screenwriters talk about comic books that they love, mostly from the 1980s.
And like we talked about, McCloud's art actually changes and gets even better, arguably, as we go to the black and white version of ZOT after these opening 10 issues. But still, holistically, just looking at every category of what makes a comic great, I'm pretty blown away by how well ZOT works out the gate. And this opening 10 issue arc has so many balls he's juggling in the air. And he nails it ultimately. And we're going to get to all of it, obviously. But this is such impressive work. And one thing I just wanted to touch on real quick here that I think is a real critical part of why McCloud was able to be so successful out the gate like this is it's no accident that Kurt Busiek was Scott McCloud's best friend growing up. And like we say, he was a consultant on this storyline that was credited for every issue. And then later on, there's even a second consultant who gets added to the mix. And you know, Chris, like you and I know this from being in a writer's group for most of the last decade where we meet every 2 weeks. And, you know, it's a bunch of professional screenwriters critiquing and going over each other's work to try to just, push each other to write better stories and to communicate, to make sure we know we're communicating what we think we are in our stories. I mean, I think it's so smart that McCloud formalized this concept of having a consultant on his book who was someone who, by the way, is going to go on to become one of the most brilliant storytellers in comics himself, one of the best comics writers of the modern era, Kurt Busiek. And the fact that McCloud had him as a consultant on this series is just obviously invaluable. And I think we can't understate the importance of having someone with the story brain of Kurt Busiek involved as your consultant on your first ever storyline. I have to believe that the reason McCloud is crediting Busiek, his last name, I heard McCloud pronounce it in the documentary as Busiek. I'm trying to learn that because in my head forever I thought it was Busiek, but it's not. It's Busiek, I believe. But anyways, to have someone like him involved, I mean, obviously he's crediting him because he deserved it. And then you have to ask yourself, what percentage of how great Zot's storyline is has to do with notes that Kurt might have had? I would guess it's got to be at least 5%, maybe 10%. And, you know, that's the difference between good and great so often. And if your story is 10% better because you got a guy who's going to be one of the greatest comic writers of all time giving you notes, well, hey, props to Scott McCloud for being smart enough to build the proper team and the proper system to deliver this story so fully formed. Because I just don't know too many comic book debuts ever that have a story that works on this many levels this successfully. And I think it reminds me of something that Brian Eno had said once when him and David Bowie were working together a lot. And Eno was talking about how everybody wants to give David Bowie credit for being a genius, and rightfully so. However, what Eno said is like Bowie's true genius was that he would bring the smartest people around him and he would keep them in his circle. And so Bowie would have, you know, your Lou Reed, your Iggy Pop, your Brian Eno, and all of them talking to each other, listening to his work. And Eno said he didn't believe in genius for individuals because Eno had worked with so many great musicians through the years. And he said, all these so-called geniuses, I hear all their bad ideas. I'm there in the studio. I hear all their bad ideas. And I realize what the process is to get to the great finished product. And Eno said he coined a term that he called not genius, he called it Scenius. Like as if you're in the right scene of artists and you got the right scene of people around you, and that can allow you to have Scenius rather than genius. And he felt that was a more realistic description of how the process worked for most of the true greats that he'd worked with, that it was not just like God, you know, struck one person with a lightning bolt and they created a masterpiece. It was more like, you know, all these people working together in concert to have this breakthrough and do something amazing. And so I just got to give it up to Scott McCloud for being smart enough to really formalize that process. And I don't know if he gave Kurt Busiek any money, you know, or if Busiek would have even accepted it, but the fact that he credited him, and that in itself probably is going to make someone work even harder to help you build your story because they're getting credited. And I think it's an integral part of the puzzle here. And I think it's just awesome that McCloud did that because I think it really shows in the final result here.
Well, I think everything you're saying is really spot on. I think that, you know, even some of the great debuts, like a debut that I remember thinking was fantastic, and I think it was his first work, was was Stray Bullets, right, with David Lapham, right?
It was his first work as a writer, because before that he had just drawn a bunch of books for Jim Shooter at Valiant and Defiant a little bit.
Yes, but the thing is though is that Stray Bullets, as dope as it is, it's not like those first 10 issues are, he's telling a bunch of stories. They're kind of like individual, like issues. Some of the stuff
Yeah.
kind of like tags in. Oh, this was episode 2. You meet that girl later on, and she's like episode 6, I think. But like the way that McCloud has designed this, and the layered storytelling, that the way he's putting down something now in I mean, like, I was just thinking with Deco and with Sarah, like, it's gonna show up in the next episode, obviously, but it's like we talked about that, but even the stuff with the guy, Nine Jack Nine from the previous episode and issue 2, the way he then shows, there's just the way that he's designed this, it's so layered. And I believe that this whole thing with Kurt is the key to it, because it feels like the type of stuff that Kurt was doing when he did Astro City, right? So Astro City, where it's like, oh, like he's really playing that game that comics do so well of. I'm gonna tease you with something here in issue 4, and I won't pay it off until issue 10.
Yes.
And it's like you have to, but I'm setting up all the other pieces in between so that when that thing comes up in issue 10, it hits so hard. And and that's what he's doing in here. So I mean, I don't know. I can't really think of anyone who's done like, hey, and again, it's like the Lapham thing is different because he'd been drawing. This is
Yeah.
like McCloud's first drawing outing and his first
Yeah.
is in his first time writing. I think what you're saying is right about like you surround yourself with great people. It's this thing that I remember reading. There was this thing called the Directors Company that was formed in the early 70s with Peter Bogdanovich, Francis Coppola, and William Friedkin.
Oh, wow.
Like those 3 guys had formed a company that Robert Evans gave them some sort of like sweetheart deal over at Paramount, and they were like trying to they were trying to do each other, like they were rivals, but also like colleagues. And the movies that came out of that were like, what's the movie? I mean, the movies that didn't. I mean, they all kind of were like weird in a way. Like you had Sorcerer, you had The Conversation, and then
Right.
you had I think that what's his name did Last Picture Show out of that.
Oh, damn. Yeah. So you had some very significant movies coming out of that.
Bogdanovich, or it's or maybe he messed up and did Daisy Miller come out of that because he was so in love with Sybil Shepherd. But it was this thing where it's like there was this incubator thing that you don't know, and the way the people on the outside, it's usually these outsiders who've propping up someone. Because I was reading that book called the Long Goodbye, which is like the making of Chinatown. I think this was called The Long Goodbye.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, and they talk about how when Polanski was creating Rosemary's Baby, like how important was it for him to have like this guy named I want to say his name was like his name was Osteen was his last name, and he was the editor. And he had like this Silbert brother as the production designer, and then his wife did the costumes, and and he moved that same like group of people to work with him on his next movie. And then I read somewhere else when I was reading the book about Mike Nichols that he also worked with that same editor named Osteen when he did like Virginia Woolf and The Graduate. And it was like, oh, there was like the same people were kind of working together, like in these support roles, like the editor is supporting director's vision, but it's like, but people always talk about Polanski and Nichols. They don't talk about the team they gathered. And you
Yes.
realize that once those teams like broke apart because of ego or other changes in the business or all this kind of stuff, that the director's work like wasn't as strong. And
Oh, totally. Right. Because they stick with those people for a reason.
yeah. I mean, I tell people all the time, like if you look at Steven Spielberg's work, the thing that has made the two things that make his film so signature to Spielberg is he's the director, he's got Michael Kahn as the editor, and he's got John Williams as the composer on all his films after Jaws.
Yeah.
You know, so Close Encounters till Fabelmans, he got that same. And the editor,
Wow.
so
Oh my God, that's
the editor
crazy.
and the composer is
I
on
didn't
every
realize that.
movie with him.
Wow. Well, see, that's the thing is like Spielberg gets it. Spielberg gets, obviously, that kind of chemistry is invaluable and you can't just replicate it so easily. And Spielberg also is known to stick with screenwriters for long periods too, like Steve Zalian, you know, wrote Schindler's List and a bunch of other stuff for Spielberg. Tony Kushner wrote, you know, Fabelmans, and also I think wrote Munich and a bunch of stuff. I mean, Spielberg will stick with a screenwriter for a decade plus also on multiple projects. So he gets it. When you've got this chemistry with folks, you can't just sacrifice that so easily because people don't understand. Sometimes it's like, oh, you think like a band loses their drummer or their bass player. Sometimes you think, oh, that's not a big deal. It's just the drummer, quote unquote, or, you know, just the bass player. But you don't realize sometimes how integral and how critical that person is to the creative process of any sort of creative organism. And so with like, even with Tarantino and Scorsese, you know, Tarantino and Scorsese, they stuck with the same editors for very long periods of time. Also, I think Tarantino only stopped working with the woman who'd been his editor forever because she died tragically going on a hike in Griffith Park, of all things, in Los Angeles. And that was like a tragic, untimely death. Otherwise, he probably still would be making films with only one editor for his entire career. And the thing is, all these like so-called geniuses, they realize how precarious it is for them to produce that body of work that is so celebrated. And I think what's unique to me about Scott McCloud here, to bring it back to ZOT, is that he had this awareness right away from the beginning. And he was fortunate enough to have someone like Kurt Busiek as his best friend. And also to have the lack of ego as a young creative person, because that's one of the dangers when you're like a talented young creative person, is like your ego is also the thing that can be out of control, because it's like partly your ego that's convinced you that you could do this crazy thing for a living. And so it's like your ego is kind of spurring you on, but it takes a very mature creative person at the age of 23, like McCloud was here, to think I'm good enough to write and draw my own comics, have them published, have them read by tens of thousands of people. I'm good enough to do that, but also I need my best friend here riding shotgun with me. And you know what? I'm going to listen to him and I'm going to let him push back on my ideas. And I'm going to realize when I'm wrong and he's right. That's a very unique balance to strike.
Hey everyone, do us a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time with the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when each new episode drops, and watch one of the 2 videos on screen right now. You know you want to.